to address systemic racism in the country. Our cities and our police departments are not immune to these problems, and we all must do more. In my State of the City address in February, I shared my equity agenda, an agenda that calls out racism and discrimination where it exists and my plans to address it. I also charged our health commissioner, Dr. Mashika Roberts, with exploring racism as a public health crisis. Following the first weekend of protests in Columbus, we created a new way for residents to report incidents of excessive or inappropriate force by the Columbus Division of Police. This information will be investigated by a civilian, someone outside of the chain of command, from the Department of Public Safety's Equal Employment Opportunity Compliance Office, created last year to address discrimination complaints. We have begun the work of establishing an independent civilian review board. And by July 1st, we will announce a working group that will help create a civilian review board that works for Columbus and seat that board by the end of the year. Last week, the city signed the Obama Pledge, which commits the city to review police use of force policies, engage the community to include a diverse range of input, experiences, and stories in our review, report the findings, and most important, reform our community's police use of force policies. I also signed an executive order that requires all fatal use of force cases or cases of death in police custody in the city to the Ohio Attorney General's Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Third-party, independent investigations into police use of force are critical to building trust in law enforcement, and having BCI conduct investigations will be critical to restoring confidence in the Columbus Division of Police. Just yesterday, we announced two important steps in police reform in Columbus. The first is a chief's advisory panel to allow residents to have direct input into policies and procedures of our Division of Police. I've also directed our chief of police to complete a thorough review of how chemical spray agents are deployed by police and to immediately stop the use of tear gas and pepper spray to disperse non-aggressive, nonviolent crowds. This is in direct response from what we've heard from the community and what we saw ourselves in the last few weeks following the death of George Floyd. We have so much to learn from other cities and to share what we have learned to help every community confront racial injustice. This collaboration will draw on best practices and research from around Ohio and the country to help cities do the difficult work of implementing reforms. It's now my honor to introduce our great partner in so much of this work, the great Mayor of Youngstown, Mayor Tito Brown. Mayor Brown.
Mayor Ginther, thank you so much for your leadership, not just in Ohio mayors, but across the country, and your efforts to make Columbus a safer place to live. I want to thank my colleagues that are here today. And just, I would like to say that Mayor Ginther is right. Local departments can't solve the problems alone. We're going to need external support and help. And I think that's why the mayors came together as we were sharing our stories, and each story was different, unique to where we live, but they were all so much similar to one another. And that's why I think it's going to be critical for places like Youngstown, Ohio, to make sure that if you want to live in a community where you're not going to be racially profiled. Youngstown Police Department, we do a great job in training our officers, giving them diversity training, immersing them in the community of their culture, religion, and economics for our community. However, the problem is when our residents leave outside of the city of Youngstown, they can be pulled over because they're driving while black. Those kind of systemic issues must stop in places like Youngstown, Ohio, and far too many places across the state of Ohio. We've seen great success in our community where we've had a SERVE program, Citizens Initiative to Reduce Violence, has been a great opportunity where we'll have local calls with our clergy, local meetings with our clergy. Our police chiefs sit down and talk to the clergy when issues arise, or we just have consistent semi-annual meetings to address issues that may not be brewing. But when we had the protest in the city of Youngstown, that's who we went to deal with. We have our issues with mental health, health disparities in the minority community, at health, economics, and economy is one of those areas that we all must make sure that when we're talking about reform, these are areas that we must address and look forward to making sure that they don't exist anymore. Youngstown has its problems like anyone else. But I think together, if we decide that it's got to stop, it can't just be the Black mayor of Youngstown, Ohio, the Black congressman from the state of Ohio. It's got to be our colleagues, our allies who are saying enough is enough. Now, since we planned this press conference, there's been another name added to the list, Rayshard Brooks, which should not have been there. Empathy and sympathy goes a long way. And at the bottom line, there has to be relationships with the people that you work with, that you work for. And I think that's what we're looking for coming together as a community. So at this time, we believe that it has to be the best practice, the best process, and the most systemic process to remove and eradicate this racism and unjust in our country. And at this time, I'll ask the Queen of the state, Mayor Nan Whaley.
Thank you, Mayor Brown. It's a pleasure to be with my colleagues of Ohio mayors from across the state doing really the work of frontline leaders in so many issues that have had national import that face us locally. Like most of my colleagues, we're in the process of looking at opportunities and for police reform with 5 areas in partnership with the community on ways that Dayton can do a better job in this work. And we all know and recognize that we have work to do inside our police departments and inside our cities. And as one of the mayors mentioned earlier, we have been leaning on each other and sharing information quickly about what is going on in each of our communities as we try to make sure that we create more just cities across Ohio. But we decided too that we really needed to have a staff person that is able to really connect the dots quickly for us as we make these changes over the coming months and really have that opportunity to connect quicker and then offer those to other communities as well. As many of you know, the Ohio Mayor's Alliance is the top 30 cities in the state of Ohio by population. This effort will stand up not just for the 30 cities, but for cities all across the state of Ohio. We recognize that all of our communities have better work that we need to do to make sure that the communities that aren't represented as often in our police forces feel and are treated more fairly and treated equitably. So that's the work that is among us. This is not easy work. And I know that my fellow mayors know that we didn't sign up for these jobs because they were easy, but this support will be helpful to us to make change that is important to our communities and make it quicker and share best practices, not only from Ohio, but from across the country. I think that Ohio mayors, particularly going through COVID and the work that we've done over the past 4 or 5 years, are in a special situation compared to other cities across the country. I have to tell you that we look to each other regularly to figure out how we can get best practices through, the limitations to our power in that, and recognizing that a lot of times the systems are in place for us not to make change, even though we want it. And we're at a really pivotal, amazing opportunity in our country and in our communities. We're witnessing generational change. And that opportunity is to make our cities more just. And I think mayors across the state of Ohio want to grab that opportunity and get as much change done as we possibly can in these coming months. And this will help us really align to that. This is really a time to re-envision how an effective law enforcement approach ensures safety and just outcomes for members of our communities, particularly our Black communities. And we want to make sure that we're doing that not just for our cities, but for cities across the state of Ohio. It's my pleasure to introduce the mayor to the north of me, who's been doing a terrific job, especially with his weekly fireside chats that I enjoy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Connor Stewart, and the mayor of Toledo, Wade Kapsakavich.
I'd like to thank Mayor Whaley for the kind introduction, but correct her on getting the pun wrong. While I am a Franklin Delano Roosevelt fan, what I do once a week are fireside chats. because we now live in a digital world. But Nan is doing fantastic work, as are all mayors in this state and in this country. And I want to especially thank Mayor Brown for reminding us of Richard's death that happened about a week ago down in Atlanta outside that Wendy's. Reason I mention that is because it is an indication of how interconnected we all are, and events that sometimes seem far away to us have local impacts. He was a Toledoan. He lived in Toledo. He lived and worked here all last year. He worked in a construction field. His dad and his family are still living here. And well, Toledoans know that, maybe others on this call and the media don't. But it's just a reminder that something that happened so far away at a drive-in, at a Wendy's drive-in down at Atlanta, has local impacts that bind us. Toledo is responding to this moment with reform. We believe that we generally do well on police community relations in Toledo. We believe that we have an excellent police department, but we know we can be even better. And while we have done well, our goal is perfection. And so we have already instituted reforms. For instance, we've moved the internal affairs, or in the process of moving the internal affairs division out of our main police headquarters to a neutral site. We believe that'll be accomplished within a month. We are reimagining, reinvigorating, potentially funding our independent citizen review board to provide even greater transparency and accountability on police actions. We are making, for the first time, available to the public, providing the public access to the training that we offer our officers, whether it's in the academy or throughout their career as a police officer. We've learned so much during the last couple of weeks about Zoom and other virtual learning opportunities, that when we provide diversity and use of force and de-escalation trainings, we're going to make that available to the public in a forum like this to shine more light on how we police. These reforms are just the beginning of what we need to do. We think they make sense for Toledo, but the point of this news conference is to say, maybe those ideas might make sense to other mayors in Ohio. Maybe the reforms that are being instituted in other parts of Ohio might make sense to Toledo. Mayor Ginther talked about their decision yesterday regarding tear gas and pepper spray and rubber bullets. We need to learn from each other at a time like this. Anyone who knows me knows the disdain I have for studies and reports that just end up on the shelf, never to be reviewed again. That's not what this is. This is a working group. We are going to share data. We're sharing information. We're sharing ideas. We're sharing staff. We're going to staff this effort so that the ideas being hatched in the modern laboratories of reform, which is what cities in this country are, can be used elsewhere. Cities are where Americans live. So, cities are where Ohioans live. About 80% of Ohioans and Americans live in cities. Though it is a topic for another time, it continues to be baffling, therefore, that our state and federal government have long taken such a hostile view to cities and have worked so hard to defund and destroy cities in a lot of ways. That's a discussion for another day. I might simply say, though, that problems like the ones that we are dealing with now will be solved by cities, by mayors, by police chiefs, by local activists and local governments. We have long given up hope on ever finding meaningful partnerships from the politicians in Washington. We sometimes have a better chance with the politicians in Columbus, and we're always hopeful for those partnerships should they emerge. But frankly speaking, we know that we're going to have to do this ourselves. That's what makes this partnership so valuable, and that's why we're committing the staff, the resources, and the energy into an effort that we think can make a difference in making our communities safer. With that, I will now turn the news conference over to members of the media who may have questions. Carrie, I believe, is going to recognize and sort of, organize whose question comes in when and for whom, but we certainly appreciate your time. And now any one of us are free to take questions.
Great. Thanks, Mayors. Really appreciate those comments. And yes, our first question comes from Andrew Welsh-Huggins of the Associated Press. And Andrew, we can open up your mic and you can ask this question live. And if that doesn't work, I can read it. So let's try to open up your mic and allow you to ask this question directly.
That sounds good. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for putting this together. So this is my question. It has to do with recruitment and hiring in terms of diversifying departments. So a persistent issue that's been identified as an obstacle to diversifying police departments is the way that background investigations in the hiring process can limit the pool of minorities. So as everybody knows, many agencies bar applicants with drug records, as well as applicants with low credit scores and other financial problems. Of course, it's well established that minorities experience these problems at disproportionately high rates because of long-standing discriminatory practices. So my question is, how should police agencies trying to diversify rethink those background requirements and the obstacles that they present to minority candidates? And then sort of a follow-up, but what, if anything, can or should the state do in that area? And thanks for taking the question.
Well, if I can jump in, I think we made significant progress just this past year when we did look at when it came to those background checks and reducing the time that you would necessarily hold an offense against a particular applicant. And quite frankly, having about 1,300 applicants, but also there was our data was showing that a lot of our applicants weren't making it through for the physical fitness training and we weren't paying them. So we raised the age to 40. We start paying them $26, $22 an hour as soon as they got hired. And we provided mentors and coaches through that application process to help them through and be able to help answer the questions, get through the physical fitness part. So a lot of those things we've started to institute. And quite frankly, just 3 weeks ago, we hired our most diverse class, probably in a generation. That's a baseline now. That's a baseline from where we go to be able to increase that diversity so that all of our city workforce, but specifically public safety, looks exactly like the city they serve.
And I think, and I'll add for Dayton, a year or two ago, we also took off marijuana, former issues around marijuana for police officers. And so we've been looking at that. I think the thing that we can do is share all of our information with the staff, that was staffed up, and see all these ideas, and then really institute them across us in a more broad-based way than just one-offs. And I think that's the opportunity for this work. You ask about what the state's role in this is. We've been having some conversations with the governor. I know he'll be making some announcements this afternoon. But we just, and I think they're good steps of what we've heard of. I think they're good steps, but we also recognize that he has to deal with the state legislature, but that not once, not twice, but 5 times last week really doesn't get the issue around systemic racism. And so we recognize that for this effort to move, it's going to have to move through the cities, and we're going to have to do that work really in a very lonely place without a president that's willing to consent decree, and without a legislature that really understands or does understand and just keeps on doubling down on racist acts. I'm not really sure which.
If I could jump in from Toledo's perspective, I've been mayor for 2 full years. The 2 police classes we have brought in during my time as mayor have been the most diverse on percentage of people of color and raw numbers of people of color since 1983. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the things that we do is we have a mentor group, almost a peer group of older, maybe I shouldn't say older, more veteran police officers who are people of color. In other words, sort of African American, long tenured Toledo police African Americans who act as almost a mentoring pool, who work with younger cadets to make sure they are as prepared as possible for the test. And they are also familiar with the appeals process. You're absolutely right when you talk about some of the things that can accumulate points on your record. And many of them, to put it bluntly, are driving while black offenses, headlight out, tail light out. Frankly, things that I would never get pulled over for or get a ticket for. This mentor group knows the system and can appeal some of the more ticky-tack violations, I think I will call them. And there have been cases where young African-American cadets who would not have made the class were able to do so and are today Toledo police officers because of the involvement of this group. It's slightly off on your second question about the state, but I'd like to introduce one other topic. I think this is all linked. Something the state should do is require that cities provide ongoing training to their officers throughout that officer's career. So in other words, yes, when you're in the academy, you get all that de-escalation, use of force, implicit bias training. But Ohio, sadly, is one of those states that does not require it as soon as you become an officer. Now, Toledo, and I believe every other city on this call, we go above and beyond the state standard. We provide those trainings, yes, to cadets in the academy, but to every officer, whether you're a 30-year veteran, you get those classes all the time, and we're happy to do it, and we're happy to pay for it. Too many other places in Ohio don't offer that training because the state doesn't require it and doesn't reimburse for it. So while the big cities on this call, you might have a couple dozen cities that do career-long training, you have literally thousands, plural, of municipalities in this state that stop their training the day the kids leave the academy. And that is a change that the state could make tomorrow.
Looks like we have a few more questions coming in. I'm going to go to Laura Bischoff with the Dayton Daily News, and then I'm going to kick it over to Mark Namick with Channel 3 in Cleveland. And there's a few more after that, but let's start with those two. Laura, we're going to open up your mic and allow you to ask this question.
Yeah, my question is for Mayor Whaley. Is Dayton considering prohibiting the use of tear gas to disperse nonviolent crowds, similar to action taken by Mayor Ginther?
Yes, we are looking into that. We appreciate Columbus's leadership in that work, and also not just tear gas, but we're also looking into rubber bullets. This is under one of the 5 areas, the use of force issue. We want to make sure the community is engaged in this conversation, so you'll be hearing more from us and how that is worked through. It also in really this week about that process to make sure communities engaged in the effort. We're also, we've signed, like other mayors, I think all mayors on this call have signed the Obama pledge around use of force, which requires us to look through all of these processes. But I would say everything's on the table around use of force in Dayton.
Great. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Mayor Whaley. Our next question is from Mark Namick, Channel 3 in Cleveland.
Good morning. Thank you. I think a couple of folks are asking the same question. Today, the governor is expected to talk about reforms. I'm curious how much he consulted with this network for that and what you know about it. And a secondary question is an obvious one on the buy-in that you're getting from police unions, if you've reached out to them yet. Thank you.
If I could begin, the Ohio Mayors Alliance, and specifically the 6 or 7 largest population mayors in the state, have really, I might say, developed a very strong relationship with the governor and his team. Really going back to the COVID crisis, we began having daily phone calls with him probably mid-March, and talked a lot about responding to the state's challenges on public health. those conversations in recent weeks have focused more and more on policing and police reforms. And yes, he has consulted our group, and he has shared with us some of the reforms he intends to announce today. It is not my place, and I would suspect the other mayors would agree that part of the reason we have such a strong relationship with the governor is that we're not in a position to make his announcements for him. We'll let him make those announcements here in a couple hours, but he has consulted us and we are aware of where he's headed. And I would just personally say, I think, I support the actions the governor is going to announce today, though, as Mayor Whaley indicated, he is dealing with a state legislature that is not representative, in my opinion, of Ohio. And it's a very difficult balancing act the governor has to try to produce common sense policies on policing or public health with a legislature that is so out of touch. In terms of police unions, my experience here in Toledo may be different than others. They are a part of this conversation, and they are. They are feeling, they're frustrated too. They are frustrated that, the actions of a small handful of officers all over the country has brought shame to an entire profession, and that frustration is real. They express that when we meet with them. However, all the reforms I mentioned earlier and the ones that that are coming, we have not faced any opposition from them as yet. I think they know that this is a time for change, and they want to be a part of that change, at least in our experience. Knock on wood, we've had a pretty good relationship and a willingness on their part to be a part of the solution. I think they know, as defensive maybe as they may be at times, I think they know that doing nothing is not an option this time. But again, that's just my perspective from Toledo.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, we're going to go to Bob Jones. I think he has a question for Mayor Horgan, and then we will follow up with Spencer Hickey from Hannah News.
Bob, you're muted still.
Still muted.
I'm gonna read Bob's question.
Go ahead.
He asks, "Hi, Bob, are you there?"
I am. Can you hear me
Okay,
all
go
right?
ahead. I'm sorry.
I was
Yes,
just
sir.
for Mayor Horgan, under this partnership, what do you see as the first step? I know you've taken some steps already, but under this new partnership, what do you view as the first step in reforming Akron Police? What do you get out of this group that you can say, I can take something and move it forward?
Well, really, it's those conversations I think that we have started to share even back around the time of COVID, and it has led up to this. But obviously, if you remember, Margot and I, or President Somerville and I, announced the creation of a commission or a task force to look at race and equity in the city and put together a plan of how we address that, not only in the city, but in businesses and nonprofit, and how that has systemically infected a lot of different ways of life. And I think when you look at it, I think people are looking at it as a zero-sum game, that if I get something, that somebody else losing something. And that's not how we need to approach this. I mean, this is how we basically treat people. And I know the focus has been on police reform, but really it's a much deeper conversation about how we treat people in society. And it's about being equal. I mean, it's nothing more, nothing less. It's about being equal to start. And so as Wade had Mayor had alluded to, when it comes to the bargaining units, we certainly want them at the conversation as being, or part of that conversation at the table, to say, okay, what are those things that create this distrust, and how are those actions affecting that? And so those are going to be difficult conversations to have. I think we introduced the ordinance just a couple of weeks ago with the chokeholds, and then we systemically look from there on those best practices. Columbus is doing some good things. All of us, I think, are circling and doing some of those very good things. Is how do we put them into a policy and get that support to be able to push those through to enact them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks.
Spencer Hickey, I think from Hannah, I think Mark Namick asked this similar question. So we're gonna move to George Shilcock from the Columbus Dispatch. As we open up your mic, George, for this next question, Spencer, if you have another question that hasn't already been asked and you want to chime in, feel free. But for now, I'll turn it over to George Shilcock from the Columbus Dispatch.
Hi, everyone, and good morning / afternoon, I guess, right now. I wanted to ask if the Ohio Mayor's Alliance has heard from the smaller cities about what they think about this new network that you've established and just in general implementing reforms proposed by larger cities. And if there are any concerns by them over like budget constraints that would prevent them from enacting some reforms. Like, what have you heard from mayors of Appalachian, Ohio, or Republican mayors, since none of them are represented on this call?
So let me step in and say first, the Ohio Mayors Alliance is a group of bipartisan. I think there's the top 30 cities. There's at least 10 Republican mayors that are part of this, and the funding is coming from our organization. So certainly grateful for the bipartisan support of this work. Secondly, Carrie had a conversation with the Ohio Municipal League. He's very interested in this work. They do a lot of work with smaller communities, and so this is a way that we can really bolster some of the work that has already happened in larger cities to move into smaller communities, because we do hear, at least in my community, issues around more suburban jurisdictions. And again, putting this together from mayors to mayors about how to get this done, I think is really, really important, especially as these communities, quite frankly, mostly white, are having an awakening that systemic racism exists. And so they're looking for resources, and we know that. And this is an opportunity for us to provide that, recognizing, as Mayor Kapsakavich said, that if the change is going to happen in Ohio, it's going to happen on the ground in local communities. And so we want to make sure our shops are strong, and we're doing that work for us. But then also we recognize that when a police officer in Beaver Creek does something that's really nationally, it said police in Dayton. And so we all are in this together in this work, and have to provide supports for other communities to make changes as well.
Thanks. And this is Carrie McCarthy from the Mayor's Alliance. And I'll just echo what Mayor Whaley said. We are having active conversations with our other local government partners. And, we hope that this network helps benefit not just our own members, but to the extent that we can work with communities all across the state, both at the municipal level and the county level and even the township level. We want to encourage a coalition that wants to learn and understand best practices and implement reform. And whoever wants to do that, we want them to be a part of this work. Our next question, we're going to go to Susan Tebben at the Capital Journal. Susan, we're going to unmute your mic and feel free to ask your question.
Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, this question is for any of the mayors that want to speak on this, but can any of you, or will you, commit to using some of the funding that you're using currently for law enforcement budgets to be used for those changes and reforms that you're talking about, like mental health reforms, community organizations that work with minorities, and health disparities that are prevalent there?
Well, let me just jump in real quick, and not to answer yes or no, but I think a lot of those are dictated by federal guidelines out of the Treasury Department and even our state auditor, who we work with fairly closely to get those. But that being said, I think most of our communities have levy-funded ADM boards and agencies who really, I think, at this particular point, if that's going to be a need that's going to be out there, which we've all identified, is how do we address the mental health part of it? Now, whether that is in schools or in the homes or something else, that's also part of that conversation of that social safety net that counties provide, and that, and at least identifying, saying, well, listen, the mental health of the community is important. How do we go fund that? And what's the best resource to be able to do it? Now, whether that's CARES Act dollars or whether that's ADM dollars, that's all that shift in focus of saying, that's all that difficult conversation. I think of a lot of these organizations being in the same place for a long time and doing the same thing and achieving the same result. Well, this is the hard part now. This is where the work is going to come in, where somebody's going to have to really get out of their comfort zone and say, you know what, this is a primary need, because there's a level of uncertainty out there that people just aren't comfortable with. So how do we change that? And I think some of these organizations, we're going to have some hard conversations with them. How do they address the needs? We've identified them. Now let's go fund them.
One of the challenges, just to add on what Mayor Horgan said, in Ohio is most of the social services are not done by cities, they're done by counties. And so this requires, again, I think we've had conversations with state legislators, the governor, around the fact that there's a huge number of the work of police are being done. The work they're doing is really work of mental health and social service work, and that has been cut over decades to shreds. And so now you're in this place where the only thing that's left is police to answer these questions, these issues. I think we're all very interested, as Mayor Horgan said, of figuring out ways to partner in a more meaningful way around this issue and recognizing that. And those are going to be some tough conversations. But we've had success in our communities around this. All of us have done quick response teams with the opioid crisis, and we have seen how this can be really, really effective. And so I believe there's a huge opportunity here to really think of how we marry social services and police, to have a really long-term change about how we think about policing and just direct services. That hasn't happened since probably the 70s, and our communities and our police departments are showing the way for it.
Yeah, Mayor Whaley, and Horgan are exactly right. And I might say that police officers themselves don't necessarily want to be marriage counselors, mental health professionals, caseworkers, job placement officers. But because of the systemic cuts to the social service network, probably began in the early 80s in Washington and ideologically has now played out over 40 years. The cuts have been so massive that unfortunately it has fallen to our first responders to provide these sort of basic social services. I mean, we have firefighters, and I'm sure this happens in all communities, we've had people call 911 when they can't find the remote control, in their home. And that, I know that's a little off topic, but no, what we have here is an inefficient system that doesn't work for anyone. Now, mayors are also voracious readers of what other cities are doing. And I something caught my attention just last night. The city of Dallas is now beginning to send social workers with first responders to every 911 call, whether it's a fire official or a police official. Now there's a social worker in tow. It might be a pilot project. In some ways, the partnership we're announcing here today is to learn more about these initiatives that are happening elsewhere, beginning in our state, and then trying to replicate it and fund it. And I suppose the last thing I would say is, I don't think it has to be an either or. The debate over the last couple of weeks very much has been the defund the police debate is take money away from police and spend it over on mental health or other social service needs. I understand where that comes from. I might suggest that we can do both. We can figure out a way to do both. We can still have a police department that is properly funded, that reflects the values of our communities, and still do better on programs that fight some of the root causes of the frustration we see on the streets of America: disparities in education, healthcare, job training, housing, etc. We think we can do both, and it's not. I just reject the false premise that it has to be an either or. So it is true, the budget I introduced to Toledo City Council earlier this year was in fact $3 million higher than the amended budget I just introduced last week on policing. So we have reduced the amount of money dedicated toward policing, at least in the first 6 months of this year on the budgets I presented. But that's not necessarily an ideological statement that money has to be redirected this way. I believe we can do both, and that's what we're going to try to do.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. I know that doesn't get to all those that are in the chat and Q&A function, and I will follow up with you all individually if we don't get to your questions. But let's take the last question from Madison MacArthur at WKSU Radio. Madison, we'll open up your mic, and this will be the last question. And again, for those that we didn't get to your question, I'll follow up with you and help make sure your questions get answered. Madison. Madison, did we lose Madison?
There. Can you hear me now? Sorry,
Yes,
I just got the
Go ahead.
prompt.
No problem. Go ahead.
For each or any of the mayors, when you guys are forming the police reform network that you started the call with, what are the first steps that you personally want to take to get the network up and running?
Well, certainly, I think we want to get a staff person in really, really quickly. I think a lot of us are, I can speak for Dayton, we're doing this work after countless issues that we've had, and having some support to really share best practices quickly rather than calling each mayor, which is what we're doing now. Hey, Andy, I heard you banned tear gas and rubber bullets. How's that going? So we can have a more effective use of our time to move this quicker, I think is really, really important. We certainly will pay attention to each other in these large cities first, as we're going through some pretty dramatic changes in police reform. All of us are. So I think that will be key. And then how we open it up to the smaller communities where we know we can, I think some just really good sharing of information that helps the community overall is what we'll do next. But certainly, I think we'll be internally focused as we are all doing this work. I can speak for myself, probably 70% police reform work and 20% COVID now and 10% miscellaneous is how we're spending our time. So I think getting that help for our communities is going to be really, really beneficial, at least for Dayton.
The only thing I would add, you totally agree with everything that Nan has shared, but the real power of the Mayor's Alliance has been our voice and impact on state policy and state legislation, albeit not perfectly. We have not won every battle by any stretch of the imagination, but the power of our voice at the state level because of our alliance and this coalition of 30 mayors, bipartisan group, talking about issues that are important to Ohio cities and the people that live in them, I think is going to give us a great opportunity to weigh in on what the governor is proposing, what the state legislature is considering, because yes, we are the mayors of cities and the buck stops here, and we're going to be responsible for the heavy, heavy lift that's in front of us for police reform, oversight, and accountability. But the state clearly has a role to play. And we believe that this group, this coalition, this alliance is going to help us make sure our voices are heard at the state level, and that hopefully the policies and changes and laws that are amended at the state level are aligned with our efforts locally and more appropriately resourced from the state level.
Well, thank you all for joining the call today. I know there are a handful of questions that we didn't get to. Again, I will follow up with those reporters individually and try to make sure that your questions get addressed. But in the meantime, we'll have a press release out and we look forward to giving you updates as we develop this network and continue to work to address the issues of racial bias and reform our policing practices across the state. So mayors, thank you very much for your time and your insights today. To our members of the media, thank you for all the work that you do, and thank you for joining us today. Thanks very much.
Gary. Bye, guys.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.